The late afternoon sun draped the park in a warm golden glow, painting long shadows across the grass. Daniel Parker sat on a worn wooden bench, a paper cup of cheap coffee warming his hands as he watched his 8-year-old son, Liam, kick a scuffed soccer ball back and forth. The sound of children's laughter floated through the air, a comforting reminder that life, though hard, still had its small, perfect moments. Daniel had learned to savor them ever since his wife passed away, leaving him to juggle fatherhood, bills, and odd jobs. He was halfway through a quiet thought when a piercing scream shattered the peace. His head snapped toward the sound. Near the swings, a little girl, no older than 6, stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror. A man in a dark hoodie was sprinting toward her, one arm raised, a pistol glinting in the sun. The scene seemed to slow, but Daniel's instincts kicked in before fear could paralyze him. He leapt to his feet, coffee spilling onto the grass, and ran with every ounce of strength in his legs. The little girl's small frame was trapped between the swings and the approaching threat. Daniel reached her just as the man's finger squeezed the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the air, louder than thunder. A searing pain tore into Daniel's side, hot and deep, but he didn't falter. He wrapped his arms around the girl, pulling her to the ground behind him, shielding her with his body. She was trembling, her tiny fingers clutching his sleeve. Somewhere in the distance, people were shouting, some screaming, others calling for help. The gunman's eyes widened as voices drew nearer, and in a flash, he turned and bolted toward a waiting car, tires screeching as it sped away. Daniel's knees buckled, the world tilting as blood soaked through his shirt. He tried to focus on the girl's tear-streaked face hovering above him. "It's okay," he rasped, though his voice was weaker than he intended. She shook her head, eyes wide, her lip trembling. "Don't die," she whispered desperately, her voice breaking. "Please don't die." The sound of sirens began to grow louder, rushing toward them, but Daniel's vision was already swimming, the edges darkening. He felt the girl's small hand still gripping him, grounding him to the world, as the reality of what had just happened began to settle over the park. The sirens drew closer, their wail cutting through the chaos of the park, when the screech of tires suddenly joined the noise. A sleek black SUV came to an abrupt stop at the edge of the playground, its engine still rumbling as the driver barely had time to open the door. From the passenger side, a woman in a tailored navy suit and sharp heels jumped out, her hair slightly disheveled from the rush, her eyes scanning frantically until they landed on the small figure kneeling beside Daniel. "Sophie." Her voice cracked as she sprinted across the grass, dropping to her knees and wrapping the little girl in her arms. Sophie let out a sob that dissolved into hiccups, clinging to her mother's expensive blazer as if afraid to let go. The woman, Olivia Grant, held her tight before lifting her gaze to Daniel. For a split second, the polished mask of a powerful CEO slipped, replaced by raw gratitude and shock. She took in the blood seeping through his shirt, the paramedics pressing gauze to his wound, and her jaw tightened. You saved my daughter," she said, her voice trembling. Daniel blinked against the dizziness, forcing a faint smile. She was in trouble. That's all that mattered. The paramedics were already lifting him onto a stretcher, their movements swift and practiced. Olivia moved closer, still holding Sophie, her shadow falling over him. "I'm Olivia Grant," she said quietly, almost as if introducing herself wasn't enough to explain the weight of her presence. "And I don't forget debts." Daniel was too lightheaded to fully understand what she meant, but her tone was steady, deliberate. As they began to wheel him toward the ambulance, Sophie squirmed from her mother's arms and ran to the stretcher. She clutched his hand tightly, her little fingers warm against his chilled skin. "You're my hero," she whispered, her voice quivering but full of conviction. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a pang that had nothing to do with the bullet lodged in his side. Olivia gently pulled Sophie back, her expression unreadable as she watched him disappear into the ambulance. In that brief moment before the doors closed, he saw something in her eyes, a silent promise that their paths wouldn't just end here. 2 days later, the steady hum of hospital machines filled the small, sterile room where Daniel lay propped up against thin pillows. The pain in his side was dulled by medication, but the weight of reality, missed work, medical bills, and his son waiting at home, pressed heavily on his mind. He was staring out the window when the door creaked open. Olivia Grant stepped inside, her presence instantly shifting the room's atmosphere. Gone was the perfectly armored CEO from the park. Today, she wore a simple cream sweater and dark jeans, her hair loosely tied back. In her hands was a paper bag, the faint aroma of herbs drifting out. "Homemade chicken soup," she said, setting it on the table. "From my mother's recipe," she insisted. Daniel managed a small smile. "That's kind of you." But Olivia's sharp gaze lingered on him, unreadable. After a pause, she spoke again. "I looked into you." Her bluntness caught him off guard. "You're a single father. You work construction part-time. And you've been behind on rent for 2 months. Daniel stiffened, his pride bristling. "I didn't save Sophie for a reward." Olivia's expression softened slightly. "I know. That's why you deserve one." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "I own Grant Enterprises. I can make sure you and your son never struggle again. A stable job. Better healthcare. Whatever you need." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I'm not a charity case." At that moment, a small head peeked around her leg, Sophie, clutching a folded piece of paper. She walked up to Daniel's bed, shy but determined, and handed it to him. It was a crayon drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a big red heart, with "ME plus hero" written in uneven letters. Daniel stared at it for a moment, something warm and unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Sophie gave him a small, hopeful smile. Olivia looked down at her daughter, then back at Daniel. "This isn't charity," she said quietly. "It's gratitude. And maybe, it's the start of something else." Daniel glanced between them, realizing that this woman wasn't here out of mere obligation. There was something deeper in her eyes, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. Weeks passed, and Daniel's life began to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. True to her word, Olivia covered his medical expenses without hesitation, but she didn't stop there. She arranged for him to work as a safety supervisor at one of her company's construction projects, a job that paid steadily and came with benefits he'd never had before. Liam and Sophie quickly became inseparable, their afternoons spent in parks, at the zoo, or sprawled on the living room floor drawing together. What began as Olivia's gratitude gradually turned into an easy rhythm of shared dinners, school pickups, and late-night conversations over coffee. Daniel discovered that beneath her polished business exterior was a woman who cared fiercely and laughed easily, even if she didn't let many see that side of her. One cool Friday evening, they met at a small neighborhood diner after the kids had spent the afternoon at a community event. As they stepped out into the crisp air, a passerby recognized Daniel. "You're the guy who took that bullet," the man said with admiration. "Not many like you left." Daniel simply nodded, glancing at Olivia, who was watching him with a quiet smile. They walked in comfortable silence until Sophie darted ahead to join Liam, who was examining the window display of a nearby bookstore. Olivia lingered beside Daniel, her hand brushing against his. "You didn't just save Sophie that day," she said softly, her voice tinged with something almost vulnerable. "You saved me, too. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand between me and the worst life could throw." Daniel looked at her, the streetlights catching the gold in her eyes, and realized that somewhere between that terrifying moment in the park and this quiet evening, they'd stopped being 2 strangers bound by a single act. They had become something more, a fragile but undeniable family. Sophie turned back, waving for them to hurry, her laughter ringing through the night. Daniel took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the past months melt into a deep certainty. He hadn't just taken a bullet for a little girl. He had stepped into a new life, one built not on obligation or gratitude, but on trust, love, and the kind of connection that changed everything.